In the world of our medieval ancestors, the boundary between the living and the dead was a thin, porous veil. Life was a brief, often brutal pilgrimage, a prelude to an eternal hereafter that was as real to them as the mud on their boots and the stone of their cathedrals. For the common man, the world was not a sphere of continents and oceans, but a moral battleground, a terrifying stage upon which the fate of his immortal soul was decided. Heaven was a tangible promise, a celestial kingdom depicted in the vibrant stained glass that towered above them. But hell was a visceral, ever-present reality. Its geography was mapped in horrifying detail on the walls of every church, in the illuminated manuscripts of every monastery, and in the fevered sermons of every village priest. The agonies of the damned were not abstract concepts. They were visions of demons with hooked claws, of pits of fire, and of an eternity spent in torment for sins left unconfessed. In this landscape of absolute faith and absolute fear, the greatest terror was not the simple act of dying. It was the nature of one's death. To die well, a bon amours, was to die in one's bed, surrounded by family, with a priest to administer the last rites, to hear the final confession, and to anoint the body, cleansing the soul for its journey. But to die a bad death, a mal amours, to be struck down suddenly in a field, to fall in a drunken brawl, to succumb to a swift and silent plague in the dead of night, was to face the abyss. It was to stand before God's judgment with the full weight of a lifetime of transgressions still clinging to your soul. For the wealthy, there were remedies. A lord could afford to have 100 monks pray for his soul, to purchase indulgences, to leave a fortune to the church in the hope of smoothing his path through purgatory. But for the peasant, the farmer, the common laborer, no such assurances existed. Their fear was raw and immediate. And so, in the remote hills and shadowed valleys of Britain, where ancient beliefs lingered beneath a veneer of Christian doctrine, a solution was whispered, a last resort, born of this profound spiritual terror. It was a practice so strange, so steeped in both piety and blasphemy, that the official church condemned it, and respectable society pretended it did not exist. This was the work of a figure known only as the Sin Eater. This is not a fairy tale. While the practice has been cloaked in the mists of folklore, its existence is documented in historical accounts, antiquarian journals, and local records that stretch across centuries. It was a tradition born of terror, a chilling transaction between the living and the dead, a folk remedy for a theological wound. It required a man to perform an act of profound spiritual sacrifice, and in doing so, to become the most cursed and reviled figure in his community. This is the story of the man who ate the sins of the dead, and in saving their souls, willingly damned his own. The ritual of the Sin Eater was an act of stark, chilling simplicity, a piece of theater played out on the stage of death itself. It began not with a formal summons, but with a desperate, hushed plea. When a person lay dead, and the family was gripped with the paralyzing fear that they had passed with unconfessed sins, lie told in the market, a moment of lust, a flicker of envy toward a neighbor, a messenger would be dispatched. Not to the priest in the church, but to a lonely cottage on the very edge of the village, to the isolated hovel where the Sin Eater dwelled. His arrival was a somber affair. He was a specter called forth by grief. The 17th century antiquarian John Aubrey, a meticulous chronicler of folklore and customs, was one of the first to formally document the practice in his work, Remains of Gentilism and Judaism. He describes how the family would bring a stool and place it near the body. On the chest of the corpse, they would lay a simple loaf of bread. In one hand, they would place a wooden bowl, full to the brim with dark ale. This was the ritual meal, the vessel for the sins. The Sin Eater, described by Aubrey as a figure of great want and misery, would then approach the body. He would enter the room of mourning, a pariah stepping across a threshold he was otherwise forbidden to cross. The air would be thick with the scent of death, and the silent grief of the family. He would take the stool, sit, and gaze upon the face of the deceased. In that silence, he would perform his grim duty. He would take the bread from the corpse's chest and the bowl of ale from its hand. Then, in a clear voice, he would recite a formula, an incantation that sealed the unholy contract. The exact words varied by region and by century, but their terrifying intent was unmistakable. The folklorist Bertram Spuckle, in his 1926 book Funeral Customs, recorded a version of this incantation passed down through oral tradition. I give easement and rest now to thee, dear man. Come not down the lanes or in our meadows. And for thy peace, I pawn my own soul. He was not just offering peace. He was offering his own soul as collateral. With the words spoken, he would consume the meal. He would eat the bread and drink the ale. Every bite, every swallow was a deliberate, symbolic act of consumption. He was not merely eating food. He was ingesting the spiritual decay of another human being. The anger, the lust, the greed, the envy, the pride, all the dark deeds left unatoned, all the small and large corruptions of a human life were believed to be mystically transferred from the corpse to the bread and ale, and from there into the very being of the sin-eater. Some traditions even included a pinch of salt placed on the body, a symbol of preservation, now used to preserve the sins for their transfer. Once the meal was finished, the transaction was complete. The soul of the departed was now considered cleansed, free to begin its journey to the afterlife, without the weight of its earthly transgressions. The family would then pay the sin-eater his fee. The accounts are consistent on this point. He was paid a single groat, a small silver coin worth about 4 pence. It was a pittance, a shockingly small sum. It was the price of a human soul. The sin-eater would take the coin, turn without another word, and leave the house, now carrying the spiritual weight of the dead man within him. The family could now bury their loved one with the assurance that his soul was at peace. But the man who had saved him was now more damned, more corrupted than he was before. This was not simply a metaphor. To the people who practiced this tradition, the transfer of sin was terrifyingly, tangibly real. They believed the sin-eater was a living, breathing vessel for the accumulated transgressions of the entire community. He was a spiritual landfill, a walking cesspool of damnation, and as such, he was to be utterly and completely shunned. His was a social death that preceded his physical one. The life of a sin-eater was a life of profound and absolute isolation. He was a necessary evil, and the community treated him as such. His home was always on the outskirts, a dilapidated cottage or a crude hut set far apart from the village, as if his very presence could contaminate the ground he walked on. When he ventured into town, a chilling silence would fall over the marketplace. People would avert their gaze, mothers would pull their children close, and men would make signs with their hands to ward off evil. To look a sin-eater in the eye was considered to invite bad luck, to risk having some of the countless sins he carried leap from his soul onto your own. His isolation was a form of spiritual quarantine. He was a pariah in every sense of the word. He was forbidden from entering homes, except for the grim purpose of his duty. He was not allowed to speak to anyone, nor was anyone allowed to speak to him, beyond the brief, ritualistic exchange at a deathbed. To share a meal with a sin-eater, or even to offer him a drink of water from a well, was unthinkable. It would be akin to inviting a demon to your table. Any cup he drank from or plate he ate from was often immediately destroyed, lest its contamination spread. This social death was, in a twisted way, essential to the ritual's logic. Anthropologists would recognize this as a form of institutionalized scapegoating. The sin-eater was the physical embodiment of the community's moral filth. By casting him out, by treating him as less than human, the villagers were creating a tangible boundary between their own fragile purity and the damnation he carried. He had to be reviled to be effective. He was a living paradox, the most important figure in the spiritual economy of death, and the most worthless in the social economy of life. His pitiful payment reflected this. It ensured he was always desperate, always available for the next call. It was not a wage for a service rendered, but an alms given to a cursed object, just enough to keep him alive but never enough to allow him to escape his fate. He was trapped, bound by poverty and by the very belief system that made him both necessary and despised. Consider the psychological torment. To live in a world that believes with absolute certainty in heaven and hell, and to know, with that same certainty, that your own soul is forfeit. Every time he performed his duty, he believed he was adding another's damnation to his own. He was a man drowning in the spiritual depths of others. He was forbidden from entering a church, from receiving communion, from participating in any of the sacred rites that offered salvation to everyone else. In saving the souls of his neighbors, he had irrevocably forfeited his own. The practice of sin-eating seems, to the modern mind, a grotesque superstition, a relic of a primitive past. But it did not emerge from a vacuum. It was born from a deep-seated anxiety at the heart of medieval Christian theology. The Catholic Church, and later the Protestant churches, had established clear pathways to salvation: confession, penance, absolution, and most importantly, the last rites administered by a priest. This was the Church's monopoly on the afterlife. But what happened when that system failed? In rural, isolated communities, a priest might be miles away, serving multiple villages. A sudden death from a farm accident, a swift illness, or a violent altercation meant there was no time for the official rites. This was the terror that haunted the medieval mind, the fear of a bad death. A soul that departed unshriven, burdened with sin, was believed to be destined for purgatory at best and eternal damnation at worst. The official church offered prayers and masses for the dead, but this was a slow, uncertain, and often expensive process. For a grieving family, the need for immediate assurance was overwhelming. It was into this gap of theological uncertainty that the sin-eater stepped. His ritual was a form of folk magic, a desperate and unsanctioned solution to an official problem. It was a spiritual insurance policy, rooted in beliefs that were far older than the church that dominated their lives. Historians and folklorists suggest that the idea of transferring an immaterial quality, like a sin or a sickness, onto a person, animal, or object is a near universal theme in pre-Christian belief systems. The sin-eater was likely a Christianized version of a much older pagan practice, repurposed to fit the anxieties of the new faith. Unsurprisingly, the established church viewed the practice with absolute horror. It was a profound blasphemy. According to Christian doctrine, only one figure in history had the power to take on the sins of humanity: Jesus Christ. The sacrament of communion, where believers consume bread and wine, representing the body and blood of Christ, was the one true act of spiritual consumption. For a mortal man to perform a crude parody of this sacred act, to claim he could pawn his own soul to save another, was a usurpation of Christ's divine role. It was heresy. Church records and court documents from the period show that officials actively tried to stamp out the practice. They condemned it as superstition, as witchcraft, as a devilish mockery of the sacrament of confession. But in the isolated rural communities of Wales, Shropshire, and the Welsh Marsh, traditions died hard. The fear of damnation was stronger than the fear of the priest's condemnation. The official channels of salvation were distant and sometimes unavailable. The sin-eater was local. And so, the practice did not disappear. It simply went deeper underground, becoming a secret and whispered tradition, passed down through generations, a grim testament to the persistence of ancient fears. We tend to think of such practices as belonging to a distant, unenlightened, dark age. We imagine the sin-eater as a figure shrouded in the mists of the 14th or 15th century, a product of plague and superstition. But the most unsettling and historically verified fact about this tradition is its incredible longevity. It survived the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution. It persisted, hidden in the rural heartlands of Britain, almost into the modern era. The story of the last known Sin Eater is not an ancient legend. It is a documented piece of modern history. His name was Richard Munslow, and he died in the year 1906. Munslow lived in Ratlinghope, a small village in the county of Shropshire, England. Unlike the Sin Eaters of old, who were driven to the profession by utter destitution, Munslow was a reasonably well-off farmer. His story is not one of poverty, but of profound, unimaginable grief. In the 1870s, a scarlet fever epidemic swept through his village, a common tragedy in that era. In the space of a single week, the disease claimed 3 of his children. A 4th child died shortly after. Local accounts, gathered by historians and folklorists like Charlotte Byrne and Ella Mary Leather in the decades following his death, suggest that this immense personal tragedy led him to revive the old, fading custom of sin eating. Overwhelmed by a grief that no modern mind can truly fathom, and perhaps fearing that his beloved children had died with some small, childish sin unconfessed, he took on the role of Sin Eater himself. It was a desperate, heartbreaking act of a father trying to bargain with eternity, to take on any possible stain from his children's souls, to ensure their peaceful passage to heaven, even at the cost of his own. For the rest of his life, until his death in 1906, Munslow was known in the surrounding villages as the local Sin Eater. When someone died suddenly, he would be called. He would perform the ancient rite, taking on the sins of the departed. But in Munslow, the role was transformed. He was not a reviled outcast, but a figure of tragic nobility, a man respected and pitied by a community that understood the deep sorrow that motivated him. He was a relic, a living ghost from a bygone age, walking the hills of Victorian and Edwardian England. When Richard Munslow died, the tradition died with him. He was buried in the churchyard at Ratlinghope, but for over a century, his grave lay unmarked, as if the community was still unsure how to commemorate the man who carried their sins. It was only in 2010 that the Shropshire community, recognizing the historical significance of their last Sin Eater, raised funds to give him a proper headstone, finally acknowledging the final man to hold this cursed and sacred office. The existence of Richard Munslow forces us to reevaluate what we believe about the past. It shows that the boundary between the medieval and modern worlds is far more porous than we imagine. In an era of steam engines, telegraphs, and the dawn of the automobile, a man in rural England was still placing bread on a corpse and pawning his soul for the peace of the dead. The story of the Sin Eater is a story of a profound and terrible paradox. It is the tale of a man who was simultaneously the most feared and the most needed member of his community, a social leper who held the key to salvation, a figure of blasphemy who, in his own way, performed an act of supreme Christian charity, taking the sins of others upon himself. His ritual was a testament to the terror that death held over the human imagination, and the extraordinary lengths people would go to in order to find peace in the face of the eternal unknown. He was a shadow cast by the bright light of faith, a grim necessity born of a world where damnation was as real as the soil under one's feet. As we look back from the safety of our secular age, it is easy to dismiss the Sin Eater as a mere superstition, a Gothic fantasy. But to do so is to ignore the weight of the belief that created him. For the men who took on this role and the communities that employed them, the sins were real, the damnation was real, and the sacrifice was absolute. We are left to wonder about the silent, lonely men who walked the lanes of Britain for centuries, their own souls growing heavier with each one they saved. We are left with the haunting, verifiable image of Richard Munslow, a grieving father in a modernizing world, shouldering a burden that stretched back into the darkest corners of the past, and carrying it with him into the silence of his own grave.